Welcome to the Gay Buddhist Forum, where teachers from all schools of Buddhism offer their perspectives on the Dharma and its application in modern times, especially for LGBTQI audiences. These talks are offered freely to the world and made possible by appreciative listeners. If you would like to support our efforts to share the Dharma with underserved audiences, please visit gaybuddhist.org. There you can donate, find a list of upcoming speakers, or enjoy many hundreds of these recorded talks dating back to 1996.
Okay, this time it's our tradition to go around the room and introduce ourselves. My name is Bruein.
My name is Lee.
I'm Brad.
My name is Cass.
Jack.
George.
Donald.
My name is Oswaldo.
My name is Jeff. Dave. My name is Clint.
Michael.
Jeff.
Harley.
I'm Richard. I'm Ham.
I'm Jim.
Dan.
I'm Richard.
I'm AJ.
Jason.
I'm David.
Fernando.
My name is David.
I'm Carl.
I'm George.
Rich.
Kay.
Welcome everyone, and it's my pleasure to introduce our teacher for today. I'm Baruch Golden, a longtime GBF member who has been practicing Vipassana meditation since 1998. He completed Spirit Life Community Dharma Leaders Program in 2012 and the Buddhist Chaplaincy Training Program with the Sati Center in Redwood City in 2013. He teaches Dharma to many sitting groups in the Bay Area, and he is a registered nurse doing hospice work for the past 14 years. Thank you.
So I just wanted to start with a few lines from a poem. In these dark times, you must feel loved when you read this. Lean against the hand stroking the back of your neck. Relax. In the pocket where you once kept marbles is a small bag of kisses. Open it. Let it go. You are loved. There are so many people who want this, just this. Believe me, they are not your enemies. So just during this period, feel free to just lean against the hand that's stroking the back of your neck during this talk. And remember that you're loved. There's a teacher who I never met, but who really had a big influence on me. His name is John Data Laurie, and he wrote an article called The Still Point. And it was an article that we used a lot in the jails when we're teaching inmates how to do mindfulness practice. And he talks about how we are so preoccupied all the time that we miss our life. We have this internal dialogue going on in our head, and life is passing us by. He says that we look but we don't see, we hear but we don't listen, we eat but we don't taste, we love but we don't feel. So we end up missing a lot of our life. So I wanted to really talk about just the beginning of the kind of the very beginning of the very first talk that the Buddha gave after he woke up. And I wanted to talk about the First Noble Truth and relate it specifically to this collective experience that we have as being in the LGBT community in the Bay Area. And I just wanted to check out, I live in the East Bay now, and I teach a lot at the East Bay Meditation Center, and it really is a hub of gender expression and gender identity there. And so I just wanted to check if people have to do this when I'm at the East Bay Meditation Center. If people identify if there's any other identifications of people here besides gay men, and if people feel comfortable if I use that term. This is like so East Bay Meditation Center. It's so political. We don't want to exclude anybody, but is there anyone who feels uncomfortable with that? Okay, cool. Great. So, yeah. So, so really, this talk is a little bit about the First Noble Truth and this collective experience that we share as gay men, growing up in this very heteronormative society, this culture. I'm sure everybody's heard talks about the First Noble Truth and all four of the Noble Truths on the Eightfold Path. But my interest is always how can I take that and how does that really apply to me? And so I wanted to just read a little bit of the description of the story of the Buddha talking about giving his first discourse, his first teaching, the first sutta, which really was the teaching that started the wheel of Dharma rolling. That's what they call it. So it's a very important teaching. In the Theravada tradition, it's considered to be the quintessential teaching. It's a teaching that within this teaching, everything exists. It's really the only teaching that you need to have in order to awaken. And in fact, after the Buddha awakened and he was walking back to Varanasi, he ran into the 5 aesthetics that he had been practicing strict asceticism with, and he gave the talk. And of the 5, one of the aesthetics, his ears were open, and apparently in that moment he woke up. So that's how powerful this teaching is. So if your ears are really open, this could be your moment. So, and then I'll talk a little bit about the First Noble Truth, and really it's hard to talk just about the First Noble Truth without it kind of all the Noble Truths being rolled into it. And then I really want to just connect this collective experience that we have as being gay men and talk a little bit about this vast internal landscape that we have the opportunity to practice in as gay men, as growing up in this area where we are, and also some external factors and how they influence us and how we can practice with that. So, the Blessed One was living in Kosambi, which is apparently is an ancient city in India, in a woods of simsapa trees, which are rosewood trees. He picked up a few leaves in his hand and he asked the bhikkhus or the monks, "How do you conceive this, bhikkhus? Which is more, the few leaves that I have picked up in my hand or those on the trees in the wood?" "The leaves that the Blessed One has picked up in his hand are few, Lord. Those in the wood are far more." "So too, monks, the things I have known by direct knowledge are more. The things I have told you are only a few." "Why have I not told them?" "Because they bring no benefit, no advancement in the holy life. Because they do not lead to dispassion, to fading, to ceasing, to stilling, to direct knowledge, to enlightenment, to nibbana. This is why I have not told them to you." And what have I told you? Well, this is the Four Noble Truths. There is suffering. There is the origin of suffering. There is the cessation of suffering, and there is a way leading to the cessation of suffering. That is what I have told you. And why have I told it? Because it brings benefit and advancement in the holy life, because it leads to dispassion, to fading, to ceasing, to stilling, to direct knowledge, to enlightenment. So he knew a lot of stuff, but he only chose. This was the first thing that he talked about with these guys, with his with this little group of community members that he was practicing with. And a couple days ago, I was talking to a friend of mine and she was asking me what I was going to talk about, and I said I was going to talk about the First Noble Truth. And I met her about 8 or 9 years ago in a sangha, in a sitting group, and she's a very serious practitioner. She took the Sati training with me in Buddhist Chaplaincy, and she said, "Oh, I've never really spent much time thinking about that." So I think there's a way where we can kind of know about this, but not really consider it as being very important as far as our practice. So the way that I hold the Four Noble Truths is I hold it as a organizing framework in my life. As a theoretical framework, as a conceptual framework, as a map which can direct me as I'm moving around in the world. And we whether we acknowledge it or not, we have these conceptual frameworks or these organizing maps that we use as we move around in the world. When I do my hospice work, I use a hospice framework for looking at someone's experience. And within that, if they're having symptoms or pain, I use a particular framework for how to look at their symptoms so there's pain. And the people that I'm working with, they have their own organizing framework, and sometimes the framework that I'm bringing with me as a hospice nurse doesn't really match theirs, and so there's this potential conflict that can happen. And as we walk around in the world, we also are viewing things through some kind of framework, whether we acknowledge it, realize it, that it's happening or not. And so we can make this choice to use this Four Noble Truths as a way of practicing. And in a way, the Four Noble Truths are like hypothesis. It's like we kind of go out into the world and we hypothesize, oh, there is suffering, and then we see what our direct experience is, and if that hypothesis really has any relevance to us in our life. So they're not absolute truths, they're truths that we could work with. So there's this guy named Federico Moramarco, and he wrote a poem which I saw printed on a wall in Berkeley, and I looked it up online, and I just wanted to read a few lines about this, because this is really what the Buddha is asking us to do. The Buddha is really asking us, he had this incredible experience of waking up in this world and having direct knowledge, this really vast direct knowledge, and he basically is asking us to let go of the experience our experience as we know it, and consider this other possibility. So he is providing a bridge from our personal experience to a more universal kind of experience. So Mr. Moramarco says, have you ever considered the possibility that everything you believe is wrong? Not merely a bit off, but totally wrong. Nothing like things as they really are. If you've done this, you know how durably fragile those phantoms we hold in our heads are. Those wisps of thought that people die and kill for, betray lovers for, give up lifelong friendships for. If you're open to that possibility, the possibility of being absolutely, completely wrong about everything that matters, how different the world seems then. Everybody who was your enemy is your friend. Everything you hated, you now love. Everything you love slips through your fingers like sand. And so there's this way where we can be so sure about what we know in this world, about we can really solidify about who it is that we think we are, our identity. We can get really tight around our views and beliefs, the assumptions that we make in our life. And what would it be like if we just took the attitude that everything that we believe is completely wrong, or we're not sure about what our experience is? And so this practice, what the Buddha is, and this happens this is one reason why I love meditation instructions, but what the Buddha does in the meditation, what Western teachers do in the meditation instructions is they're like operating instructions for our own system to carry that into this more universal way of seeing things. It's a reprogramming that can happen to us as we take our sitting practice and we listen to the directions on how it is that we're sitting and how we can experience and be with the direct moment, have direct awareness. We're reprogramming, which kind of sounds kind of scary in a way, the mind and the body and the heart, so that we're inclining ourselves to be more in the present, and we're developing a different way of being in the world. So, I may never get to the First Noble Truth, but so we know, though, it's sort of like we know that from our experience before we start meditating, and maybe after we start meditating, that our perspective, the assumptions that we have, the views and our ideas can be somewhat limited. And I was listening to NPR the other day, and they were talking about bird vision. I don't know if anybody heard that. It was very cool. And they were talking about how birds have 4 color receptors in their eyes, which apparently is more than we have, and that there's some birds who have the ability to see polarized light and magnetic light. And this is a light that typically humans can't see. And so we know that our perception of the world is somewhat limited by the physicality of who we are and how we're constructed. And so maybe in our life we've had these experiences where we have had different perceptions of life, of light. Maybe when we were young, or if we're really quiet, we've seen light emanate from things. Maybe we've seen light emanate from ourselves. Sometimes our hearing can be quite, we would call it altered, and we hear things that we haven't heard before, or we experience things in a completely different way. And a lot of times these kinds of experiences can happen in the meditation process, especially when you're sitting for a longer period of time. And so sometimes these happen outside of our experience, and these can be, for some people, they can be life-changing experiences. Really, one of these experiences can really change the course of your life. So we know that, or we can assume that our own experience is somewhat limited. It could even be more limited by the fact that we can be so sure of what it is that we believe and everything that we're really not open to other possibilities. And so this process of sitting is a way of deconditioning our mind, allowing this loosening process of our mind so that we're not that attached to views and beliefs. It doesn't mean that we don't have them, but our relationship with them can change to the point that we're not reacting to them, that the habitual mind is not driving us forward and we're not just operating blindly. So in the First Noble Truth, it says there's suffering, and we all know that, but there's a way that we tend to personalize the suffering and make it our suffering. And what is happening in the First Noble Truth the Buddha is proposing is that we look at the suffering from a more, more universal perspective. We depersonalize it instead of saying, I come here to this sitting group because I'm not feeling good and I really want to feel better and this meditation isn't working right now and I know if I sit longer, if I sit a different way, that I'm going to feel better. We're really shifting from this very personal perspective to a more universal perspective. It's like, oh, this is suffering, and this suffering is a human experience. what the Buddha does is he makes this hypothesis. He said that there's suffering. He says that the suffering should be understood. So he's coming up with a statement. He's telling us to practice with the statement. And then when we practice it and we have seen for ourselves that there is suffering and that we haven't turned away from it, we haven't clinged to it or pushed it away, and we have this moment where it's like, yeah, this is suffering, there is suffering, then we've understood it. And that's considered in the world of Buddhism to be an insight, that we have gone from the intellectual understanding of this First Noble Truth, and through our practice we've seen it from ourselves, that we've had this deep seeing into a moment of our experience. So the way this is connected to being gay men is that we have a lot of suffering in our life as gay men, and that our experience growing up or being gay or whenever kind of this awareness came to us is significantly different than growing up as a heterosexual man. So my experience as a gay man is different than my experience of my heterosexual brother, of which I do have a heterosexual brother, but you could, of all heterosexual brothers, of all heterosexual men. So, and the way that I view it, after doing a lot of practices, is that identifying myself as a gay man is and the assumptions that I make and how I view and the beliefs that I have is a social construction of where it is that I live. And it has a lot to do with the conditions that I'm living in. It has to do with the family that I grew up in, what's going on in the world at this time, in the part of the world that I live in, the family. And so I've had this experience which I've made a lot of assumptions about myself, and I have this kind of internalized these ideas about what it means to be gay in the world in San Francisco at this time, in this moment. And as I do practice, I start realizing that a lot of it, and even before I realized that a lot of it is inherently not true. It's not true about me, and we know. Just being in the world, we see these assumptions that they make about LGBTQI people. But the fact that they're inherently not true doesn't mean that they don't have real consequences for us. And the consequences for them are the raw material that we can use in our practice. There's a way that I came out kind of over a period of a lot of time, but definitely by the time I was 20, I was kind of struggling to come out, but pretty out. There's a way that I was living the impact of this social construction of who it is that society had decided I was and how it is that they saw me as a gay man. And of course I had my own internal ideas, but I had internalized a lot of ideas I grew up in Southern California, from the particular conditions that I was living in. And so we have this, we've been socialized into this group identity collective. So a lot of our experience is fairly shared experience, unless we grew up outside of the U.S. or someplace different. And we're kind of within a certain range of ages here, that we have learned about who we are from where it is that we live in the world and the time that we live in, and it's really unavoidable. And so, and it's become this kind of ubiquitous understanding of who it is that we are, so that a lot of times we don't even see it. We're really unaware of this conditioning and how it's impacting us. So I don't know, this might be considered too much information, but when I was on the LGBT retreat a couple weeks ago, one of the things that comes up, and it is, if I know many of you have sat retreats, and one of the things that come up when you sit at retreat is you immediately start scanning the environment and start checking out who's present, and who is like the most interesting person to look at, and those sorts of things. That's always happening. You could kind of try and turn that off, but it's always functioning in the background, and it's a good thing to work on, because of course you can't act out anything. Well, you're not supposed to. I've heard some stories, but and there's this experience that we have, and I'm assuming that most of us are experiencing sexual feelings. I did a talk recently down in Redwood City. They have a little sangha down there, and it's an older group of people, and they asked me specifically to do a talk about sex and Dharma. And afterwards, these older gay men said, "Oh no, we're post-sex." It's something that we don't even relate to anymore. But anyway, I'm just assuming that we all are sexual. And so when you're sitting in the retreat, you're sitting there, and all of a sudden you have this feeling like, "Oh, I'm really horny." Or however you describe it, maybe, you just feel like, "Oh, I'm sitting by that guy and I really would like to have sex with him," and then the mind starts attaching to that, and you could just imagine you could do a whole 45-minute sit fantasizing about what it's going to be like to be with this guy. And so, but it hasn't been until recently that I have included that feeling, that experience, as part of my practice. I've always had a very habitual mind around that, and it's been very reactive. And I know, in talking with other men, that this is very typical, that we have this internal experience of feeling like having sex, or however, turned on, or however it is that you describe, amorous, or whatever. And instead of staying with the experience, we react more. We'll go to our computer, our online computer, and we'll, get into our, whatever, what is it? Say we want to describe that experience. I don't do that particularly well, or else maybe we'll turn on our grinder, or our scruff, right? Scruff, yeah. And then scruff, or we'll just feel like taking a walk into the park, or we'll plan our next trip to whatever. We'll just, or when my partner comes home, it's like a big setup. I'm going to pounce on my partner, or whatever. And so there's a lot of ways that we can immediately distract ourselves from that experience, so that we don't have to really experience what it feels like to be in this body, to be in the mind, and to just sit with what it feels like to be horny. And just like all experience, we start seeing that the feeling arises and it passes away. It's impermanent, just like everything else. But there's a way with our growing up gay and having the span of time that we have this lived experience and this identity as being gay, that our experiences have solidified around us to the point that we don't even see them anymore. They're just there. And with practice, what the Buddha is asking us to do is to open up our experience, so we start including everything in that experience. We have a lot of suffering as gay men. There's a lot of it, and we've habituated to it a lot, but there's times where we feel it a lot. But we especially feel it maybe when we go home to visit our family, at a family gathering. It's a really good time to do practice. Noticing the inequities in how the family treats us. Or how it is that we feel, like if we go home with our husband or our partner or our boyfriend or whoever, what that's like to bring someone home for the first time, or there's a certain amount of moment-to-moment experience that's really useful to practice with. There can be a lot of discomfort that comes up around that. We also have, a lot of kind of deep wounds as gay men, growing up in this sort of, like I was saying, a heteronormative culture. It's like we grew up and we were essentially being trained to be heterosexual men, but it turns out we're not, or maybe maybe some of us are, but as part of that process, a lot of it, especially, older men, we have grown up feeling really unlovable or damaged in a way. I know I came into my practice really feeling, when I started doing practice a long time ago, I felt like, this was before I started doing Buddhist practice, that I was damaged and that spiritually maybe I could correct that through my practice. I had a lot of beliefs, there's a way that we can feel flawed, we can feel incomplete, we don't feel whole. So there's this vast area of a practice potential for us. So and we could even practice when we come into this room. I've mentioned this before here, where this is a great place to consciously start practice, because as we have all this conditioning as gay men growing up in the Bay Area, we're automatically drawn towards certain people. There's certain people that we're avoiding, so we're kind of being pulled by desire, or we're kind of trying to get away from someone. And then there's a whole group of people, probably the majority of people, where we're not even paying attention to them. So in Buddhist words, that would be considered Vedana. We're paying attention to what's pleasant and what's unpleasant, or the neutral. And this is a great place to practice. And just pay attention to those feelings of like, oh, I really want to sit next to Carl, or I really don't want to sit next to Carl. Sorry, Carl. And just notice it. Or, remember the time that you came in and there's like some person that you've never seen before, and it's like, oh, all of a sudden there's an increased interest, and maybe the place that you always sit when you walk in is not the place that you're going to sit that day, because you want to sit closer to that new person. So there's this maneuvering that's going on in the mind and in the body and in the heart, and it's an opportunity to practice. So we can open up to these experiences and practice in this way. Let's see. So what the Buddha is asking us to do is to just include everything in our experience. And everything means everything. And when he says there is suffering, it's like, okay, this is suffering. Suffering must be understood. So he's asking us to recognize it, be with it, not turn away from it, not turn towards it, but just have that experience of being with it. And in every moment, there's an opportunity to be with our experience. We could practice with it in that way. When I first started doing practice, I didn't really think that I had suffering. I kind of felt like there are people that were really suffering in the world, and that my experience was, it could be pretty bad sometimes. I could be pretty happy, but it didn't really fall under the category of suffering. And then one time I went onto a retreat, and this is when I had some of my first deep seeing into the First Noble Truth. Is like, I really got that what my experience was suffering, and that I can see it. And I think I spent those 7 days just sort of in a way, just watching all the suffering that I had in my life. Not all of it, but just a lot of it. I had this profound experience of understanding suffering in a way that I'd never understood it before. And of course, since it's a retreat, it's a really perfect opportunity. There's all these supports for really turning towards and staying with it. So I just want to read a quote by Ajahn Sumedho, who is a pretty cool guy. He's still alive. I think he's a retired monk at this point. I don't know. I don't know if a monk ever retires, really, but and he says, oh, and just before it's like once we start seeing our suffering, we start seeing how we create our own suffering, and we see how we can let go of that and how suffering ends. We start having the opportunity to be more mindful and be more, in a sense, concentrated. So we start having these moments where we have this release from the suffering. There's this, if you've ever had this experience where you're kind of in the throes of a difficult situation, and then all of a sudden, either through practice or whatever happens, you are able to let it go, there can be this incredible sense of spaciousness, of stillness and quiet, a kind of peacefulness. And that's really what the Buddha is talking about in the experience of seeing your suffering and then watching the suffering go. Is that in that process we could have these moments where we understand our experience in a way that we have this experience of peacefulness. So Ajahn Sumedho says, with mindfulness we are willing to bear with the whole of life, with the excitement and the boredom, the hope and the despair, the pleasure and the pain, the fascination and the weariness, the beginning and the ending, the birth and the death. We are willing to accept the whole of it in the mind rather than absorb just into the pleasant and suppress the unpleasant. The process of insight is the going to dukkha, or the suffering, going to the suffering, looking at the suffering, admitting the suffering, recognizing it in all its forms. Then you are no longer just reacting in the habitual way of indulging or suppressing. And because of that, you can bear with suffering more. You can be more patient. And Sharon Salzberg says, without the rigidity of concepts, the world becomes transparent and illuminated, as though lit from within. So, I think I'll end there. And maybe just for a minute, and this is always something I hate that people do, but just really kind of become really mindful of how you feel. I want, just for a minute, just turn to a neighbor. So just kind of pay attention to what comes up, because I always hate talking to people when I come to a sitting group. And just sort of sense into what, if anything, came up for you around this gay conditioning, our gay habits, our gay beliefs, our views, or the experience of having this shared collective experience and the particular type of suffering that we've had in our lives growing up in this place. So, and just turn to a neighbor, it doesn't matter who it is, and just for a minute or two, just share what has come up for you in your mind, body, and heart, and then we could open it up and see if there's any comments. So, and I'll ring a bell. Well, it seemed like there's there's something to talk about. So I just wanted to open up and see if anybody had any comments, responses. I feel like I'm going to start carrying my hospice program. Criticisms, compliments, no. Just, if there's anything that you want to say. Anything that came up for you?
Yeah, I appreciate that you're, the stress you put on the mental constructs that we don't even know we're carrying around. I had a college reunion last weekend, and I was responsible for the big program part with 350 people. And I had worried this thing for months, and I realized, and I had a physical exam, my annual physical, and the doctor said, well, you're tense. I didn't realize how much I was carrying this burden. And now it's gone, and I feel not tense. And it was completely unconscious. I had no idea that, anyway. And it was optional. I could have done it without worrying, I suppose. But we might not have gotten that standing ovation. I'm very relieved to announce that it's gone.
Yeah, and it's nice to notice what it feels like when it's over, too.
Right.
Yeah. Yes, sir?
Yeah, well, it's just I was talking to David, and we're approximately the same age, and it's just about, you talk about the suffering the gay men experience, and for me, it's just very, as I shared with David, just everybody I know, every gay man who's around my age, no matter how happy and well-adjusted they are right now in their lives, we've all went through this period of our life. There's shame and self-hatred and low self-esteem. And it's just so great to see young gay men and lesbians in their 20s or someone who've not gone through that. And I know there's a lot of homophobia in this country. I know in certain parts of this country, young LGBTs are still suffering. But it's just great to see that there are a lot that aren't suffering. That we're having to plow through that period of self-hatred in order to get to another place.
Yeah.
Yes, totally agree. And it occurred to me, we often, or at times discuss, why are we so monocultural in a way here? And it occurred to me, given our backgrounds, young people today, they don't want to be just with other gay people their age. And because they don't feel the need to sort of huddle with, their minority that, before we were felt so isolated, I imagine. I mean, I did. I was one, we were strangers in a strange land is what it felt like to me.
Yeah, it's interesting with your things that these two guys have brought up. But I like to think that the reason why younger gay people are having an easier time is what we went through and what we've accomplished and what we had to suffer and push forward. I agree with you that personally, my personal experience is that I think that gay men tend to suffer more than straight men in a similar, I have two brothers, and they didn't have to deal with a lot of things that I had to deal with coming out and accepting myself, and it was a very difficult process in my family. And then dealing with AIDS, something that, and I suffered from not only the loss and seeing what it was doing to our community, but I suffered from the fact that people's attitudes towards us and blaming the gay community for this disease and how much that was a part of it, and that negativity. So, which I, of course, believe is totally false. But anyway, and another thing I realized as you were talking, by the way, thank you very much for your talk. I really enjoyed it. Is that when I turned and shared, I realized that I have also incorporated in my suffering the history of what gay people have gone through. Whenever I read, things that we've had to go through in the past, and talk about throughout history, even Oscar Wilde, what happened to his life. That causes a feeling of suffering for me. What's going on in other countries where gays are more persecuted. and are still, don't have what we consider the freedoms here, that to me adds to a certain level of suffering as a gay man. So thank you very much.
Time concludes.
Oh, really? Bummer. It's like a stone rolling down a hill. Can I just say one thing? One thing that, just in response to a couple of things, is really, especially being in the East Bay now and at the East Bay Meditation Center, is we grew up in this really binary culture where you're either, you're like either a heterosexual female or a heterosexual male, or maybe you're gay. And now it seems like there's this opening where, especially in the Bay Area, where people are looking at experience in terms of, in addition to their gender identity, where, how you identify either male or female, but gender expression. And there's this incredible gender expression that's happening now in the Bay Area, where I was seeing it on the LGBT retreat. It's like, you cannot make assumptions about anybody anymore. It's just like people, this binary system that that was imposed upon us is starting to crack a little bit. And we all grew up in this way that was very kind of strict, and I know a lot of us didn't really fit into it. I know as far as my gender expression, I was very feminine. When I was growing up in high school, I used to wear makeup to high school, and there's ways that we just didn't fit in, but we've always tried to fit in. And so, that too is kind of a part of our history and kind of the legacy of what we carry around with us. And so it is really great, even though there have been huge shifts, full marriage equality, we still have this history, this lived history, and so we still have these incredible opportunities for practice that we could turn towards our experience. And like the Buddha says, the meditation, mindfulness meditation, or the Dharma is a way of deconditioning the mind, of freeing ourselves from these places where we become very entangled. And that sort of is like flypaper, is like the suffering clings to that. We have the opportunity to really work with that. And a lot of times we just have to set the intention, make the choice to do that, because we may not even think about that part of our life that much. So, right. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the Gay Buddhist Forum. If you would like to hear several new talks per month and be notified of upcoming speakers so you can participate live, please subscribe to this podcast, like us on Facebook, and join our mailing list by visiting gaybuddhist.org.